This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Malach.
This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy. Every week, we interview authors of books and studies that we find interesting. If you like us, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find out about it on our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review.
Our guest today is Gilad Malach, a research fellow and the director of the Ultra-Orthodox in Israel program at the Israel Democracy Institute. The Ultra-Orthodox in Israel have been one of the most badly affected communities by the COVID pandemic, and it has precipitated and highlighted trends within it. It has also called into question some elements of its relationship with the state. These are some of the topics we will be discussing today. Dr. Gilad Malach, welcome back to the show.
Hi.
If we look at ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel and in other places in the world, like New York, for example, we see that they were much worse hit than their non-Orthodox neighbors. What is it about the ultra-Orthodox lifestyle that accounts for that? And, more importantly, is it necessarily so? Are successful measures to stop the pandemic, such as social distancing, and the ultra-Orthodox lifestyle mutually exclusive?
Let's say that we have a few reasons for the fact that the pandemic hit so hard on this community. First of all, about the data itself, 42% of the sick people in Israel are from within the ultra-Orthodox community. 42%. We are talking about a group that it's around 12.5% of the whole society in Israel. So
it's almost 3 times the proportion in
exactly, even more than that. It's unbelievable.
Closer to 4.
Oh, 4 times, yes.
Yeah, between 3 and 4. Both of you were right. So this is the phenomenon, yes. So we need to explain it. So on one hand, we can say that it is connected to their way of life, especially regarding the fact that, for example, Bnei Brak, the city, is the most crowded city in Israel per kilometer. So we are talking about cities or towns that are very much crowded. A lot of people live there. And also, if you are talking about per room, meaning almost there are double people in family per each room, more than almost 1.5 people in one room, it's a lot. So it's very hard to handle in this situation. And if we are talking about social distancing, it's very hard to have such social distancing. This is one explanation. But there is also things that are connected to their compliance to the rules, the laws, legislation, and the rules of the state. And we can discuss it.
Let me just ask you on a technical level, what's the main source of their infection? Is it their high-density families and where they live, or is it the yeshivot, or is it the synagogues, or is it, other crowded neighborhood spots? Where are they really getting infected?
I can tell you that, of course, that the phenomenon itself, that it's so dense, the cities affect, but we can say much clearly, because there were some very crowded towns around the world, that the pandemic didn't hit so much. So it is sure that the fact that they were crowded in closed places like synagogue, like yeshivot, and in these places, it's not just a lot of people in one room. They are praying, they are studying, meaning they are talking loudly, and this fact affect these results that we already mentioned.
But is it really down to the fact that they wouldn't change their habits that much as other people did or would? Is it the fact that the yeshivot and the schools remained open, and the synagogues remained open, and the religious leaders, in many cases, refused to comply with the instructions, with the laws of the state, and it trickled down to the population at large?
This issue is very important regarding the results, because for them, I want to explain you that when they are there is compliance to the rules or legislation of the government, it's regarding things that are connected to their secular life in general. But here we were talking about their religious life. And the state told them, you need to shut down synagogues, yeshivot, and places like that. And for them, the authority regarding to this issue is not the state, it's the rabbis. And because of the fact that the rabbis, and we can define here between the first wave and the second wave. At the first wave, there was a delay in this compliance. At the beginning, the rabbis said, okay, you can continue with yeshivot and chederim and schools for boys. But after 2 or 3 weeks, they shut it down, and also in Pesach everything was closed. So there was a compliance at the end of the day. But on the second wave, and it was towards the high holidays and Sukkot, and after that, they decided that the price, the spiritual price for keeping the rule, is much higher than the price, the physical price of becoming sick, or even that some people will pass away. And it's very hard. I can see it in your eyes that it's very hard to understand. But I can add here another factor. The point is that the Ultra-Orthodox society is very young society. If we...
You mean the median age?
Exactly. And if in the general population there are 15% of the population is above 65, regarding the Ultra-Orthodox population, just 3% are above 65. So after a few months of the pandemic, they realized that, okay, a few people have died, but not so much. The panic that was around the world, but also within the Ultra-Orthodox society from the pandemic, became much less traumatic. And they decided that it is a danger, but especially if we are referring to youngsters opening schools, yeshivot, and things like that, it won't be danger.
So I was going to ask, looking at their behavior and their insistence and the demonstrations, the insistence on leading the regular life, from the outside, and we are all outsiders, it looks like a death cult. It looks like they're saying we prefer to lead our religious lives even at the expense of dying and infecting our grandparents and infecting children. And whatnot. You're saying it's not quite that. They just don't really believe that it's such a danger. And I understand the statistical and demographic point you're making. I've thought about this for a long time. But nobody can really diminish how serious the virus is. People who've had it know what it is, so those who get it badly, even if they don't die. So which is it? Do they think it's sort of a bit of the hoax that we hear about in America? They think it's really not that dangerous? Or they really don't mind getting sick and very sick and a few people dying?
And then it plays also into wider issues such as the trust in the scientific community and state authorities. How does it play out in this sense?
Okay, now you're doing the pile-on.
Yeah, I can tell you that it's also, for me, it's very hard to explain, even though you might say it's less dangerous than the state portrayed it or the scientists portrayed it. It's very hard to explain why even elder people, even people who are above 65, went to prayers on high holidays. If the rules were, you need to protect yourself, but if you are young, you can go to pray or to study. But everybody above the age of 65 is forbidden to do it, not because of the state, but because of saving life. But we were familiar to some facts in some communities that even elders went and participated in all these religious events. And it's very hard to explain it. So here I can say, first of all, there is a definition between some of the communities that says the youngsters can do it, but some of the communities, the extremists that said everybody can. I mean, it is ironic that most of the ultra-Orthodox, when they went throughout the street, they were covering themselves because the police were enforcing it throughout the streets. But when they arrived to a synagogue or yeshiva, they entered to the dangerous place, they took it off.
This says so much about the absurdity of policy and enforcement in Israel. The policemen were enforcing it outdoors, but they weren't enforcing it indoors?
Yes, especially within the second wave. And there was even, we faced a phenomenon that even some managers of schools, I want to add that the way that schools get decisions is totally different than state schools, because when the state says the schools need to be shut down, okay, so every school shut its doors and that's it. But within the ultra-Orthodox community, the schools are semi-private or semi-private schools. So every manager, headmaster needs to decide for his school. So even some moderate managers, they thought that there is no enforcement. On the first wave, there was enforcement. So anybody who opened it got the ticket, and it had an effect on the whole community. But on the second wave, in more than a month, there were just 65 tickets. It's almost nothing. So even moderate people, parents were calling them and said, why don't you open your school? Everybody does it. And so the effect was not just on the extremists, but also on the moderates. They also, Israelis in the term that they don't want to be frail. They don't want, they don't want to say why he is not punished on that and I got the punishment.
Yeah, but beyond the limits of enforcement, I think that the more interesting question here is, of course, the voluntary compliance or the willingness to see themselves as part of the larger Israeli society. And as you write in your publications, of course, the Orthodox community is not a monolithic entity. There are many shades of gray within it, and much of it was also displayed in the way that the different groups within the community responded to the state instructions. And I'd like to ask you to take us through some of these shades of gray, the cases in point, as it were. And I'd like to know whether it really means anything other than the fact that they see themselves as more integrated than others. I mean, is the level of compliance parallel or in correlation with that?
Yes, I can say that on one hand, it is very common to refer to three main groups within the ultra-Orthodox community: the Hasidim, the Lithuanians, and the Sfaradim, and also referring regarding the virus and their attitude towards the instructions of the state. We thought that the Hasidim there is less compliance, and the Lithuanians are, let's say, caught in the middle, and the Sfaradim are very much more having obey to the rules and refer to the instructions very seriously. So this is one way to define the community and to see differences. But I can also tell you that another axis is the difference between modern ultra-Orthodox, mainstream, and extremists. And it's quite clear whether you are Hasid or Lithuanian or Sfaradi, if you are more moderate, meaning more modern, more close, your feelings are more close to the state, you will obey. There will be much more compliance to the instructions of the state. And if you are less modern and against the state and don't feel at home in the state, you will keep your own your way of life, your style as you did, and that's it.
And in general, that distinction between the more moderate / modern and more extremist or conservative on some level, that cuts across the first groups that you mentioned?
Exactly. Even within the Hasidic stream, there are some differences.
And the Hasidic are considered the most extreme,
exactly,
generally.
Exactly.
Yes.
They are very conservative. But there are some Hasidim that they are more moderate. And specifically, these Hasidim mostly obeyed more to the rules. And also regarding the Lithuanian community, so you saw that also the axis that refer to modernity within the society is very important. And I can say that even the modern ultra-Orthodox were quite angry regarding the mainstream or the extremists.
So the modern are a minority.
Yes, you are right. They are a minority. It's a minority that grows rapidly because of some changes that takes place within the community.
You mean demographic changes?
Yes, because a lot of people are at the last 10, 20 years are integrating into the labor market, going to higher education and things like that. So people sometimes become more moderate or open-minded to the general community. Also meaning that they are more open-minded to resources like communication, like using the internet. Of course, if you are an ultra-Orthodox person who reads just the ultra-Orthodox newspaper, you will hear some voice. But if you are also familiar with the internet and you are familiar with general sites and things like that, first of all, you understand more about the pandemic. And second, it most likely is that you will obey more to the instructions.
The interesting thing is that when you look at the political representations, the Haredi parties in the Knesset and in the government, they have tremendous political power. They are seen as the kingmakers and Netanyahu's most loyal coalition partners. And in many ways, Netanyahu has been criticized over and over again for succumbing to their political demands in order to secure his own political future, and even, facing his criminal charges now that might come in especially handy. Has their tremendous political power, I mean, they have been in between for a long time, but the fact that now with the COVID response, that, for example, the interference of the Haredi politicians prevented localized lockdowns on
the traffic light model.
Exactly. It was supposed to be fragmented, and the most badly hit communities were supposed to be the ones under curfew, and they were almost entirely Haredi, and that was struck down by Haredi politicians. Does the average Haredi realize that there is his political representation there in government has tremendous political power and so-called works in his favor?
The ultra-Orthodox society lives in an enclave culture, meaning that everything is interpreted as it connected to whether it's towards us or against us. So all their interpretation of policy making for them was whether it supports them or not. In their interpretation, for example, if there was one case or a few cases that the police gave tickets in schools or outside on the streets, and their daily newspapers and other sites put it, very clear that there is enforcement on the community, but regarding the demonstrations or on the beaches in Israel, everybody were doing whatever they wanted to do.
So that is the secular Israelis.
Exactly. So if you would talk to most of the ultra-Orthodox, they would say to you that the enforcement was totally against them. So even though we have the data and we have the definition between gathering outside and gathering inside, the important definition between that, but for them, there was much enforcement, and they will give all the light on the enforcement that was against them. So the conclusion for them will be that the state was very hard and tough regarding
Is that how you explain the results of the Israel Democracy Institute survey that says that there has been a great decline in the trust of the Haredi in their own political parties, in their own political representation?
Yes, the point was, and we were a bit surprised to see it, the point was that at the beginning, some of the politicians thought that the decision of shutting down some municipalities and things like that, very hard restrictions on Bnei Brak, for example, they supported it. But the Ultra-Orthodox community was very angry about that. So they thought, they expect from their political leaders to defend them. And to defend means not to shut Bnei Brak if you don't shut Tel Aviv. So on the second wave, when I'm not talking about the politicians, when the professional health prestigious leaders of Israel said that you need to operate this traffic-like model and to shut down some Haredi towns, their political leaders understood that they need to fight for the community. Maybe they thought it is dangerous, but they had no choice but to fight for the community, and they succeeded. And we saw that this model wasn't operated. There is now an operation of this model, but just after the high holidays, just at the last months, when the red cities are Arab cities and not ultra-Orthodox cities.
This raises so many questions for me. I mean, you're saying that some of the Haredi leadership would have wanted to take greater precautions and shut down, but they didn't feel comfortable advocating that position because they were worried about their constituents. And this goes back to your point about moderates who were annoyed when some of the mainstream Haredi communities kept everything open. If you do believe in science, and you do want to protect Saba and Savta, older people or the younger people or anybody, and you're Haredi or you're a Haredi leader, not that I really knew what you're talking about because we didn't, from mainstream media, it was hard to see examples of Haredi leadership who actually did want to shut down stuff. Most of them were advocating, as you pointed out, for keeping everything open. But how does a moderate, maybe we shouldn't even use the term moderate, just parts of the Haredi community who are self-critical of the mainstream behavior and want to protect the community against corona, how do they get their voices heard?
I think we saw that, for example, as I mentioned, there is a difference between JTS, United Torah Judaism Party, the Ashkenazi Party, and Shas Party, the Sfaradi Party. There was a difference between these parties. Because Shas Party represent the more moderate ultra-Orthodox, and we saw that, for example, Aryeh Deri, the leader, he understood the fact that there is danger in opening some places and things like that. But also that, on one hand, he understood it, and he voted for some restrictions. But on the other hand, on Yom Kippur, he fought that the synagogues will continue to be open. And he fought that even weddings will have the permission to do ceremonies of 400 people. It's a lot of people. Because on one hand, he understands the scientific data, he understands it. But on the other hand, he understands the will of a lot of people.
But wouldn't there be some possibility for him to talk to the people who support his party and say, let me tell you, I have been privy to all the data. If we continue this practice, you will all get COVID and some of you will die. Isn't there any possibility for a politician to lead?
On one hand, he said it, and he did it a lot of time. He said it's very important to keep the rules, etc. And some rabbis within this community also said it. But on the other hand, there is the pressure of the continuing the regular life and ceremonies.
To what extent do you think that the role of the rabbinical leadership here was detrimental? Because one thing that really blew my mind in the survey results that we were just talking about is that as much as there was a great decline in the ultra-Orthodox trust in the political leadership, there has hardly been any decline in the trust in the rabbinical leadership. Is it because of the same reasons you're talking about? The rabbis told them what they wanted to hear, and therefore they're still happy with them, and the politicians were torn between a rock and a hard place, and therefore they paid a political price for it?
I can tell you that we made a survey and we saw that there was a great effect on their trust on their political leaders, but just a tiny effect on their trust on the rabbis. But the main reason for that is that believing the rabbis is fundamental belief within this community. If you say that the rabbis were wrong, you are not part of the community. So even
it would be like their support for the rabbinical authority is like the rest of Israel, Jewish Israel's support for the IDF. 90% trust.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
IDI surveys.
Exactly. So it's part of the thing of being an ultra-Orthodox, but it's not part of their belief that to say that their political leaders are perfect. So they make a pressure on them. So as much as they can't criticize their spiritual leaders, they can do it on their political leaders.
Listen, one of the policy recommendations that you've made in articles that you've written has to do with, better cooperation with the community's leaderships, consultation, having them represented in the Corona committees. I think that sounds all like wonderful ideas, but we're talking 8 months into this pandemic. I mean, hasn't any of that been implemented? After the first round, when we realized that there was a problem of communication and a need to accommodate special communities and their different lifestyles, why has that not been put into place already? And if it has, is it not working?
The point is that some actions were taken, and especially regarding advertisement and
public service advertisements. Yeah.
Exactly. And also work with some local leaders, especially if we are talking about mayors and municipalities, ultra-Orthodox mayors and municipalities. The cooperation becomes better throughout the time. I can say 2 elements. I'm talking about my recommendations are connected to 3 main elements. The first element is the policy itself. To portray the policy with cooperation with leaders. It might be political leaders, but it might be also municipal and other leaders. Meaning, when you decide about legislations or any rules, you need to understand the need of the community. On one hand, you need to be equal to other people. But if, for example, there are dormitories for a lot of times, so the treatment might be different. If there are some religious needs connected to prayer and you find an option that is not inside synagogues but outside. So while you are writing the legislation, you need to cooperate with the community. This is one thing that wasn't prepared enough. This is one thing. Okay, the second thing is when you decide about something to do very good advertisement, this is the second thing. And the third thing is the enforcement. And here was the second failure, that at the first wave we saw an enforcement. And on the second wave, we saw that even the police became much more political because they thought, okay, if we will enforce it, the political leaders, the ultra-Orthodox political leaders will fight against that. So they very cautious about that. So the result, if we are thinking about the future, we need to think about 3 main points: policy, advertisement, and enforcement. And this is the way to handle the situation. On one hand, to cooperate with the community, but on the other hand, to be much more tougher with such a lack of cooperating. We need to handle with that.
Do you think that the COVID crisis will have long-lasting effects on the community, whether it's the decline in the trust in the politicians? Will it translate into a decline in the political power of the Haredi parties, a spillover of Haredi voters to other parties perhaps, or Haredi voters staying at home, and the proportion of the parties within the Knesset would decline as well. And in other respects, I mean, from what you say, it's pretty clear that the community has managed to weather the storm, as it were, right? To maintain its lifestyle while paying a small price. But do you think that there might be any long-lasting effects in this sense as well? I mean, people who are more critical of the way the community responded to the pandemic and in a way perhaps was willing to sacrifice them for the sake of the greater good, which is studying the Torah. I mean, other things like that. Do you think that once the pandemic is gone, will they go back to where they were before? Or not?
I think that there might be an effect. First of all, I'm talking about the whole society, the general society in Israel, meaning not the ultra-Orthodox. I think that the pandemic and the whole situation made a lot of people to be aware of the importance of dealing with the ultra-Orthodox community. They became aware to the fact that we are talking about 12% of the population, but they might affect the whole population of Israel. I mean, maybe...
But all Israelis are now aware of that, but are the Haredim aware of that?
So, first of all, the fact that all the Israelis are aware on that is, the effect is that maybe more people will say we need to be more tough, or this is very important issue when we go to vote in the Knesset or to pressure our representative, we need to do a lot of pressure on that. On the other hand, it might affect initiatives to cooperate with the ultra-Orthodox society. But the issue of integrating the ultra-Orthodox society becomes much more important for the all Israelis. This is one thing. But also when I refer to the ultra-Orthodox people, the definitions that I made between moderate and mainstream or extremist, I think it became even more important because, as I told you, there is a lot of critique even within the community on the question of compliance of the mainstream or the extremists. So there is a chance that more people will say, okay, we are an ultra-Orthodox, but we believe that we need to have a better communication with the state. We see that if we use technologies, modern technologies, we have better ability to have knowledge about the pandemic, and we have a better tools to use in our home when we are stuck at home. So maybe it's better to be more modern, and we feel apart from the mainstream and from the extremes. So we might face a wave towards modernity, even a higher wave towards that than we face at the last 10 and 20 years.
Okay, our listeners don't know this, but you and I, Gilad, have had some interesting conversations about the percentage of Haredim in Israeli society and how their growth rate hasn't really kept up with their birth rate, which I think we attribute to possibly attrition. So can you tell us just a little bit about to what extent there is dropout from the Haredi community? And going back to Gilad Halpern's question, do you think that will play into it?
We made, the IDI, we made a research recently, and we discovered that 13% within the community are leaving the community. There is a dropout rate of 13%. Let me be clear about that. It doesn't mean that they are becoming religious. Meaning some of them are not becoming secular, but modern religious. But they are leaving the community and they are like religious Zionists. But for us, as researchers, it's a very important move because...
As a public opinion researcher, this is huge. I mean, because it has a lot to do with how big their community is as a portion of society, which affects electoral results and
political participation.
Exactly. But we also got some signs that even if we refer to the last 9 months, there was a growth in the number of people who left the community.
Over the last 9 months, over Corona.
Exactly. We got some data from organizations that deal with people who are dropping out and things like that. So we also thought that it's an important issue that we need to deal with. And I'm referring to the fact that the state built at the last 10 years, 15 years, built a lot of frameworks for ultra-Orthodox in order to integrate in higher education, in army service, of course, in the labor market. But if we are facing a group that now is 13% of the society that also want to integrate, but it's very hard for them because they don't have spatial frameworks, but it is very hard to leave the Ultra-Orthodox community. So the state might need to think, and we are working about this issue, to think about also these people who doesn't want to continue to belong to the Ultra-Orthodox community. Maybe they want to continue to be religious, but the Ultra-Orthodox frameworks are not for them anymore. So this is also a challenge, a new challenge for the state.
This sounds like an extremely hot political potato, right? I mean, do you think that it has any chance of being realized with the power of the Haredi parties?
I think that in some terms, especially when we are talking about welfare support or spatial support of connected to higher education, you might say, for example, or if I'm talking about serving in the army, the state support people who came from the Ultra-Orthodox society, and at the end of the service, they will get a support in learning secular studies because they didn't study it at high school. So it's general support, whether if they are Ultra-Orthodox nowadays or not.
Yeah, I don't think that's such a political hot potato, just to say give them infrastructure that they might need.
I mean,
It's not encouraging
might be...
them.
Some of the things might be political, but some of these things might remain within the professional level, so you might continue with that.
All right, Dr. Gilad Malach, the director of the Ultra-Orthodox in Israel program at the Israel Democracy Institute. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to Itai Shalom, our producer, and once again to the Israel Democracy Institute for sponsoring this series. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 600 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. And of course, do not forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.